All right, welcome everyone to episode three of the Alignment Gap. Today, I'm excited to welcome Professor Jonathan Green, an assistant professor of political science at Duke University. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Before we start, do you mind just introducing yourself really quick, just what you do, what kind of things you're interested in, etc.?
Sure. Yeah. So again, I'm an assistant professor of political science. Specifically, I study political behavior with a focus in the United States. Right now, I've got a couple projects going on sort of information problems in democracy. So how do democratic citizens, again with a focus on the United States, use information to contribute to collective decisions? And how are contemporary trends in, say, um, polarization or technological change potentially intervening on those mechanisms for making collective decisions? So I am finding, sort of in keeping with the theme, these new large language models are certainly coming up in my research a lot. They're very useful tools, but also some questions about how these are changing our relationship to information more generally in ways that are different, in some ways good, some ways bad. Yeah.
I guess kind of the first area that I really wanted to touch on then was about your talk that you gave a year ago at the Society-Centered AI Symposium, kind of discussing that a little bit more because I found that personally really interesting. I guess just kind of generally, I guess you could start by giving a little bit of an explanation on what the talk was about, just so people have context for it.
Sure. Yeah. So this is one of my areas in public opinion. What is public opinion? How do we measure it? And it is standard in public opinion to use surveys. Surveys are an extremely useful tool for asking the same set of questions to a large number of people and aggregating their answers. But what you gain in breadth when you do that, you oftentimes lose in depth. I'm sure we all have experiences of taking public opinion surveys and being frustrated at the questions that were being asked and our limited response options in being able to answer them. Normally, say 10 years ago, if you wanted more depth from of sort of understanding your respondents' belief systems, you would do qualitative interviews. You would have humans sit down face to face, kind of like this, spend a half hour with them, and have a conversation, which allows you to learn a lot more about the individual person. But you can't do that 1,000 times. It gets really expensive. Um, so what you, again, there gain in depth, you lose in breadth. So what is now becoming a little bit more common, and what this project is trying to more fully develop, is ways of integrating large language models as semi-qualitative, they're not fully qualitative, qualitative style interviewers in a standard survey instrument. So you can ask your closed-ended survey questions at scale, but then you can migrate your respondents to a little chat box that has an AI agent do the more in-depth style of interviewing that allows the respondents to follow up on closed-ended responses that they took earlier in the survey, ask questions that don't or that are kind of hard to ask in that closed-ended kind of format, and probe a little more deeply into what the respondent actually thinks in ways that they can express in their own words. So that project is ongoing. There are a lot of other really smart people, working in that space as well. But it's one of these exciting opportunities to sort of use these tools to move the ball forward in understanding how people think about politics and understanding what public opinion is.
I just wanted to ask you, just on a high level, what do you think are generally the limitations of, I know you talked about how,
Mm,
there's a lot of trade-offs to be made in terms of gauging political opinion, obviously. So
mm.
if you do in-person qualitative interviews, obviously it's extremely expensive, extremely time-consuming. There's a lot of different barriers to that. I guess this solves a lot of it, but what do you still think are kind of the limitations as of now that we see with LLMs being used in this context?
Yeah, so there's still open questions about how to aggregate the data you get out of these interviews, right? Like when you interviewed 1,000 people, you have 1,000 conversations. Um, you don't, this is kind of the point. You don't get to, count up how many people are going to vote for Donald Trump in the 2024 election. You can do that if you asked everyone to check a box whether or not they're voting for Donald Trump. It's a little harder to do um, in that interview kind of setting. So there are some cases where you actually do want a closed-ended response, and these kind of tools are just not useful for those kinds of questions. There are still a lot of open questions about reproducibility and sort of model selection, right? So, like, do different models behave differently as interviewers, and what are the standards for sort of scientific replication there? Um, should researchers who use these kind of tools be obligated to share their code, share their prompts, things of that nature? Um, and sort of how do we take existing best practices from other forms of research and apply them to this very new kind of setting as well. And then, there's some more practical considerations can come up when you're building one of these agents or implementing them about what is the right set of prompts and how do you arrive at them? Is there a systematic way of developing the prompt engineering that's not just this kind of ad hoc, you have the conversation with the robot until it feels right and then you deploy it, which is kind of where a lot of this is at this point, but also not super satisfying as well. So.
I guess leading off of that, I kind of have two questions. The first one is, are there any kind of issues, or have you personally seen or experienced anything related to perhaps biases in data and the way, kind of these LLMs prompt users and prompt people who are answering these questions?
Yeah, so the talk I gave uh, about a year ago, um, one of the things I was interested in was how people apply sort of abstract belief system kind of reasoning across multiple issues. And uh, so I had the respondent articulate, the interview was started off being about the death penalty, and then we were trying to identify what are the big ideas, what are the big reasons people use to inform their stances on the death penalty, and then do they apply those same reasons to other issues that might relate to fairness or justice or reciprocity or punishment, things of that nature. And the model I was using at the time, or the platform I was using at the time, um, had a hard time making that transition in the interview without prompting it with some examples of like immigration or taxes or abortion or something like that. So then when I was analyzing the interviews, and looked at like what are the other issues that respondents list as related to their views on the death penalty, it was exactly those same issues at the top of the list. Because the AI agent was including them as examples of potential connections the respondents could make, right? So we had encoded that in the prompt, and the model was just spitting it back out. Um, so you have to be very careful when you're doing this because the models are still not very subtle as interviewers at knowing what you, the researcher, want without sort of spitting it back out at the respondent as well, uh, which you could imagine developing a more tailored model that is like for interviewing that is less sensitive to that. But when you're taking a general purpose model off the shelf, you have to be a lot more intentional about how you instruct the agent to not do things like that in ways that, again, you kind of not don't necessarily anticipate until you see them. Yeah.
Right. I think another kind of question I had then is, how does the process of kind of that, just so everyone's kind of aware, how does that process of like prompting a user work? Is there a kind of disagreement? Is there pushback? Is it all kind of agreement? Is it all just like asking the person to elaborate further on their views? How does that process kind of work?
Yeah, so it depends, right? So for some of the kind of interviews that I'm interested in doing, um, it's more just we are just interested in learning about your beliefs. Um, one of the things that can be frustrating when you do that is the models have a tendency to be very sycophantic, right? Whatever the user says, like that's great, that's so insightful, your beliefs are fantastic. When sometimes what you want to do is probe tensions in the respondent's beliefs. Hey, you said, this and that might be in conflict. How do you navigate that tension? So, for one of the interviews we're designing right now, we have a pre-survey of closed-ended policy issue questions. We're asking respondents for, I think, 20 of their issue stances and their ideological identity. And one of the stages of the interview is if the respondent takes, say, they identify as liberal, but take a more conservative stance on some issue, we want to talk about that. We want to understand how you reconcile this non-normative policy stance that you've taken. So we're trying to find ways to build that into the interview, um, and maintain sort of respectful but probing kind of questions about how you navigate potential conflicts within your own belief system without coming off as saying, well, your beliefs are wrong, right? We're not trying to say that, but hey, explain this to me? All right, here's something that might not make sense. So, or might not make sense to an outside observer. Um, yeah, so but again, it's a little bit of trial and error of like how to strike the right balance there. Yeah.
I guess the question then kind of is, I guess, it's kind of specific to this project, but
Mhm.
also kind of more generally in terms of how regular people just interact with LLMs in
Mhm.
2026 and how we're kind of seeing that trend play along. Is there potential issues with either A, the models being sycophantic and those political views kind of being further ingrained and further, kind of entrenched within people's psyche, or B, is there even issues with even if there is the degree of pushback, if the LLMs aren't really giving strong pushback, could it even further entrench their views? Like, is there kind
Mhm.
of an element of, I guess, the echo chamber that we're kind of seeing with LLMs and people?
Yeah. So potentially, this is an empirical question, right? And you actually um, don't necessarily need the LLM in the loop to ask the question of does prompting people to actually reflect on their views cause them to change their views? So there's a lot of work in like empirical deliberation literature on you know does deliberating on an issue solidify your views or cause you to change your views? And it depends, right? Sometimes one, sometimes the other. Um, and it's unclear to me to the extent to which LLMs are sort of fundamentally different in this regard in a public opinion kind of context where what we're asking is starting from your beliefs and then just talking about them. And the act of talking is thinking in some way, and you're thinking in ways you might not have otherwise. So, you can imagine experiments where you compare just the straight shot closed-ended survey to a non-LLM based kind of like stop and think kind of task, where you just have people write themselves for a little bit, like an open-ended box, versus a longer conversation, like seeing what happens. There was also some really interesting work, and this is more in like how to use LLMs to answer interesting questions than it is about the LLM itself. But some really interesting work recently on the what's called the backfire effect in political science, and it's actually a contested hypothesis. So the backstory is 15 years ago, at this point, there was a paper that got published arguing that. Um, Under certain conditions, when people endorse false claims, so in this case, uh, Iraq had weapons of mass destruction before the United States invaded. It's like the specific claim, and you correct that claim. You say, independent investigators found no evidence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Like, here's the sort of expert opinion. Then some people would double down and become more likely to believe that claim because you corrected them. This is called the backfire effect. And ever since then, that effect has been very hard to replicate in the lab. A lot of people have tried. It's a very popular, highly cited. theory that every time, pretty much every time, political scientists have tried to replicate the effect, they find that people actually update their beliefs in the factual direction when you correct them with factual information. So the question is like, why did they find the backfire effect in the first place? They weren't making it up, right? This is like a sincere finding. So like, why did that work that one time? So there was a um, paper that just came out last year, um, led by Yamil Velez at Columbia, that used large language models to do a couple things. And his argument was in these other studies that have tried to identify the backfire effect, one, the correction has been passive, right? It's just mere information. And two, the specific false claims often have no emotional meaning to the respondent.
Mm.
We test the same false claim for everybody, and we correct anybody who endorses the false claim, whether or not you actually care about the underlying issue at stake. And what was distinctive about the Iraq WMD claim was that a lot of people cared about it. It was a highly salient issue at the time, and it was emotionally charged, right? People really cared about the stakes of that claim being true. So what they did in the experiment was they first elicited a belief that the respondent really cared about. And they had the respondent supply that belief. So rather than giving everybody the same claim, whether or not they cared about it, what do you care about? Let's talk about that. And then they used large language models to come up with counter arguments or sort of countervailing information. And they not only did that, they also randomized how civil or how uncivil the information was presented in. So how mean is the response, ranging from totally neutral to like, you're stupid for believing this. And what they found was you can get the backfire effect, but you need both an issue that the respondent really cares about, and you need to insult them. That even for the beliefs you really care about, if you present counter information politely, people accept it. And what the backfire effect probably is at the end of the day is respondents telling the researcher off um, as part of they're not rejecting the facts. They're rejecting being insulted. They're
Right.
rejecting the researcher telling them they're stupid. Um, and you could only do that kind of research with this kind of tailored intervention that ratchets not just um, what the specific belief is tailored to the respondent, but also the intensity of the correction in ways that I think that kind of stuff is just fascinating and something we couldn't have done 3 years ago. Yeah.
Right, right. I think also kind of on that same token is the fact that when LLMs are eliciting certain responses or probing people about why they care or why they believe this certain thing, I think it's kind of you get a broader range and an easier accessibility to a range of like responses and like reasonings and moral reasonings and all these like different practical
Mhm.
judgments and trade-offs that people kind of make that you couldn't kind of get before. And I'm
Mhm.
I'm guessing that with LLMs, with these new technologies, it's going to be easier and easier to kind of aggregate these responses and kind of have those things come up as well.
Yeah, or when you think about like, research into like why people have the preferences they do, or how to, test, frame and counterframe, like how are political debates likely to play out if we propose a given policy issue? Uh, like, let's say you're um, not even taking this out of the sort of scholarly realm. Let's say you're a Democratic pollster, right? And your client is going to propose a policy issue, and you want to know how this is going to play out in political debates. You're going to propose this issue. Democrats are going to take stances. Republicans are going to take stances. Um, Normally what you would have to do is like identify the messages that are likely to come out, which means you're going to have some Democratic research assistant try to come up with the Republican reasons against this policy. And they may or may not do a good job of that. Um, what you can do now is these language models are very good at adopting personas, right? So you can generate a bunch of reasons for and against that Democrats or Republicans are likely to take, and then systematically test which ones are performing better or not to identify the best Democratic reason and the best Republican reason for and against the policy in a much more systematic way than
Right.
just guessing what opposing parties are likely to say about a given issue, or coming up with those reasons in a much more efficient and kind of systematic manner as well. These are things that the models are quite good at. Is translating sort of shifting in embedding space on that left right dimension, or yeah, generating a lot of ideas. Yeah.
Would you say that in your experience kind of working with these models and, even just probing by myself, like, I've talked politics with Claude and ChatGPT myself, trying to kind of understanding what I consider, the general consensus or whatever. Um, do you think that these models kind of cover the range of reasons of why people believe certain things? Like, do they kind of cover like most areas, or are they kind of lacking in certain areas as well?
So they're very good. And the extent to which they are good is going to depend on the extent to which you have covered the range of possible opinions on the internet. Right? This is the training data. So for most of the kind of hot button issues that you could imagine arguing about, all of the arguments have been made on Reddit somewhere. Um, Right. So you can, I actually have a colleague, another institution that does this as a teaching exercise. It has ChatGPT like argue about Israel Palestine, and like all of the arguments about Israel Palestine are on the internet, and ChatGPT can actually do a very good job of having a very civil discussion back and forth about Israel Palestine, in ways that humans are unlikely to, because you can explicitly dial, like turn emotion off, right? ChatGPT is not going to get pissed off at you over expressing an opinion that ChatGPT disagrees with. Like it's just not
Right.
a it's arguably one of the reasons why it's not human, right? Is that it doesn't do that, and humans do that. But so for those kind of debates where we can be pretty confident that everything's in the training data already, it can do a pretty good job. Um, what we can be less sure about is the debates we haven't had yet, right? New issue gets entered into the agenda. Some surprising event happens tomorrow that's not incorporated into the training data. It's going to do a lot worse at that. So like when uh, the Trump administration removed Nicolas Maduro, very surprisingly overnight, right?
Right.
The language models were not very good at arguing the merits of removing Maduro from his head atop the Venezuelan regime, because the models were still convinced that Maduro was running Venezuela. They hadn't incorporated that new information yet. Those kind of like new events or more obscure issues that we just haven't, that humans haven't argued about yet, are going to be a little harder to sort of do the synthetic argument for. Um,
I guess then the kind of question is, ChatGPT alone has, 800 million monthly users. It is more and more mainstream to use these kind of LLMs. And more importantly, I think it's not just the quantity of people using it, but kind of the attachment and depth that people use these LLMs and kind of integrate it into their daily life. So if I'm someone that uses ChatGPT for, I mean, almost as a Google replacement now, right?
Mhm.
How does that kind of affect my thinking of current events and new events when, I feel like there could be potential issues with like, a new event occurring and I just ask ChatGPT, it prevents,
Yeah.
presents, a biased version, something along those lines.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm really worried about with that kind of search engine behavior, and I actually think Google has done a lot of damage to its own like brand here,
Right.
for leaning into these AI summary answers, is that it really fundamentally changes the relationship between the information you're consuming and the source that produced it, right?
Right.
And that sort of the provenance of where that information came from is actually a really important component of understanding what that information is and how you can use it in the world.
Yeah.
Right? Did this fact come from the New York Times or from Wikipedia or from Reuters or from some other like random blog post from someone who's not an expert in that field?
Yeah.
And there's still like, OpenAI can say, well, we have guardrails or we have processes in place for, curating, verifying, and taking from more reliable sources, whatever, it's still important that the human end user engages in that process of
Right.
understanding where their information came from. And the Google is now explicitly encouraging you not to do that, right? To not leave Google and go to the source, but to stay on Google and have them give you some weighted average of the answers on their front page.
Right.
Uh, and you know, to a first approximation, that's oftentimes enough for the user, but it changes the user's relationship in information with information in ways that I think have some long-term kind of downsides. Yeah.
Right.
Mm.
I think kind of the question there is that, with AI, how do we kind of make it so that the information coming is something we know, right? Like a source that, like, I remember, when I was like in elementary and middle school, they would
Mhm.
do these like, tests on where am I getting my source from, like
Mhm.
what type of leaning does a source have, whatever, whatever. But it's becoming increasingly more difficult to do that. Do you see that kind of affecting, either polarization in a way if people think that whatever is being presented to them is an objective source of truth rather than kind of something subjective? And really a weighted average of
Mhm.
opinions or based on their previous chat history and kind of their leanings and what the chatbot thinks it wants to hear, etc.
Yeah. So the causal effect of large language models on polarization, I think, is really hard to identify. Um, we were doing a pretty good job of getting polarized without large language models. And we were doing a particularly good job of searching for confirmatory information using the old version of Google as well, right?
Right, right.
Um, so I'm a little less worried about that per se. Um, or I don't know how much new or how new LLMs are in that regard. Um, I'll also say these models are getting, or the companies are getting better at reducing the kind of hallucinated facts.
Yeah,
So, when you ask ChatGPT to like give you sources for, get you started on a lit review, it now like links to the paper in
yeah,
ways that it didn't necessarily 2 years ago, which is great. It's fine. It might not give you the five best papers for that topic if you know what you're looking for, but it can get you started, sure. Um, I think it's ironic when I was your age, we were cautioned not to use Wikipedia or Wikipedia is not a reliable source because it's just
yeah,
humans.
right.
It's humans editing. And now, if I was giving you advice, I would say Wikipedia is a great source. It's humans. It's actual humans.
Yeah,
Yeah. And it's self-correcting in ways that are kind of interesting. Yeah. So, uh, yeah, I think generally, the user demand for information that supports their worldview is longstanding and had already been sort of accelerated or streamlined by the internet. And if anything, you would hope that uh, you could imagine building in some guardrails to large language models saying, hey, it sounds like you're really looking for confirmatory information here. Would you consider or something like that?
yeah.
That might be a little bit wishful. Yeah.
I think that's a couple of years and a lot
Yeah.
of lobbying down the line. So
Yeah.
we'll kind of see with that. But another th kind of thing that I wanted to touch on was with these LLMs, obviously the vast, vast, vast majority of their trained data is the internet and primarily English speaking Western internet, mainly. And
Yeah.
so do you see that having any bearing on, maybe not even political questions, but even more like moral questions or questions about ethics or fairness or justice or all of these different things
Mhm.
kind of get skewed towards this like Western cultural, mindset as compared to the rest of the world?
Certainly. And there's been some really interesting work. I don't remember the particulars off the top of my head, but I know there are people who study this, who take different models and try to systematically answer like what are its biases
Right.
in not just political dimensions, but like is it better at answering some of these tasks in English versus in other languages, or does it embed different cultural assumptions in different languages? So we know that that's generally a thing.
Right.
And we know that it's very hard to avoid, given the sort of structure of how these are made, and the fact that there's just more English language on the internet than there
Yeah.
is in other languages. Um, and I think different companies, and we should keep in mind that these are all products managed by companies that are at the end of the day comprised of people who
Yeah.
have their own biases and sort of have to make decisions about what are the inputs and how to make the outputs.
Right.
Different companies are going to pay different amounts of attention to being intentional about getting harder to reach sources of data to include um, in training. I also think we ask too much of a lot of these general purpose models. I don't know, given the structure of how these things are made, if it's reasonable to expect a single model to be as good in Spanish and Portuguese and Tagalog and Farsi as it is in English.
Yeah.
Just in the same way that like Claude Code is much better at coding than ChatGPT is off the shelf because it was made for coding tasks.
Right.
Um, I think we should um, this is just my personal view. I think lower our expectations about how good any one model will be, and open up some more optimism that more smaller models with specific purposes will accomplish those tasks really well. And so we should expect a little more like corporate diversity, model diversity, task diversity in the models we're using for specific things, rather than expecting one set of weights to get all of it right in one shot. I just don't think that's reasonable.
Right.
Yeah.
I think another big, consideration that people often have with regards to AI is kind of democratic backsliding. There are a lot of considerations about that. Often people say that the first form of AI, or I guess its most primitive form, was social media. We kind of saw how that played out across, a variety of elections in like Myanmar and even in the US, very domestically. But how do you kind of see AI affecting, democracy and the function of governments across the world, across kind of a range of, political
Yeah.
systems?
So I'm a like again, I think we have to ask like what is really new about large language models when we think about something like misinformation or the demand for confirmatory evidence,
Yeah,
that nature. And again, we were already pretty good at getting pissed off at each other using claims that stretch the truth
right.
before large language models. So there's been a little bit of research on um, LLMs in misinformation, and they generally find, say, like political deepfakes are about as convincing as other forms of propaganda, right? They're not better necessarily at doing this. They make it a little bit cheaper, sometimes a lot cheaper
Yeah,
to scale. Um, I'm a little more worried about um, these models' ability to sort of flood the information environment,
mm,
right? With claims that may or may not be true, but might create artificial sentiment, right? Distort our estimates of public opinion by shifting the balance of what we see
right.
on media. Um, in ways that are really hard to detect because these users are indistinguishable from humans.
Yeah,
Um, that's a little harder to measure, and it doesn't actually require anything they say to be false. It's a matter of frustrating our ability to coordinate our attention and what is important rather than frustrating our ability to coordinate on what's true.
right.
It's oftentimes much easier to manipulate the information environment with true information because it's true, it's more credible, even if it's not necessarily democratically useful, because it would
Mm,
be better if we were focusing our attention on something else, um, which is something that I think. Uh, the field is just starting to really take seriously. We've been very hyper fixated on false claims from unreliable sources for the last 10 years or so. And that framework, I don't think fully captures like what is frustrating to us about our present information environment. Yeah.
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 I think what I find really interesting is that AI deepfakes aren't, considerably more convincing than other forms of propaganda. I mean, personally, I would have just imagined that seeing, if you're a conservative, seeing Donald Trump like bash, I mean, obviously within reason, right? But I think kind of more seeing kind of realistic pictures or videos of people on your side or the other side doing certain things, I guess would kind of cause me personally to kind of believe it more, if I believed it, right? I guess there is still kind of that element of these LLMs and these deepfakes aren't quite developed enough yet. And there's a lot of skepticism still as of now. So
Yeah, well, part of it is like even if the individual video is itself pretty compelling, it also creates a very quick response, right? It's
yeah,
pretty easy to correct that, be like, no, here's the original. That's not true. Like this never happened.
right, right,
The so on the one hand, it's very easy to correct. On the other hand, the fact that you have to correct it, it has opportunity costs, right? That's time and energy you're spending correcting something that's not true instead of saying anything else that you might want to say.
right.
And that's just annoying and exhausting and again, not useful for, say, democratic exchange of information. Um, but it's a slightly different problem than the information itself convinces a lot of people of something that didn't happen. Um, so like this week, right? The Trump administration arrested a woman in connection with a protest at a church in Minnesota,
Yeah,
and they like perp walked this woman, and there was a picture of the perp walk, and then the administration, I forget whether it was the White House account or the Homeland Security account, whatever, published a version of the picture where they had digitally altered it where she was crying. And like, why? Right? Like you've
yeah,
already got your perp walk. Like, why are you doing that? Um, it was much less to mislead. Like she really did get arrested and perp walked. It was to mock, right?
right.
They're trolling. And that's a different kind of harm than like misleading.
Right.
No one's under any impression that that's the original image. Like the White House isn't pretending like that's the real
Yeah.
image.
Yeah.
They're just being jerks, and that's a different kind of harm in the information environment that this made very cheap, right? You
Right.
could imagine manually altering the image as well, but now some junior staffer can just upload it to Grok and be like, make her cry, and it takes 2 seconds, and it just cheapens the discourse in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess even beyond like, disinformation or whatnot, it's about the ease, I guess, and the
Mhm.
convenience to kind of take on these actions that are maybe not like explicitly dangerous or harmful, but in the long run ha have a lot of implications in terms of
Yeah.
how people perceive different political figures or how people
Yeah.
perceive different issues and whatnot.
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to kind of lastly touch on a couple things surrounding the regulation around
Mhm.
artificial intelligence. Obviously I'm not expecting you to have full knowledge on this topic. It's just generally a lot of people's main concern about AI is artificial general intelligence, right?
Mhm.
And just kind of the trend that we've been seeing, nowadays Google has made breakthroughs with quantum computing and kind of altering kind of the instead of scaling everything and trying to make it as powerful of a model as possible, kind of trying to take a different approach to AGI. People worry that that's kind of coming soon in the near future. How do people on the ground kind of that are really worried about AGI either create the proper guardrails so that even when it comes, it's kind of properly regulated and managed, or how do they kind of, go about doing that generally?
Whew.
Yeah.
I mean, we have centuries of science fiction about what to do about how to regulate the intelligent robot.
Right.
And I am not a lawyer. But what I will say on just sticking with these language models and platforms that employ other flavors of algorithms generally
Right.
is that whatever you think the regulation ought to be, uh,
Mhm.
these platforms do not fit well into our existing regulatory frameworks. So, I'm one of my projects, right? I'm studying podcasts. and Spotify is like the big podcasting platform. And, you know, typically in the era of
Yep.
talk radio is a publisher, right? You make decisions about which hosts to air and which shows to air. And so you're regulated under Section 230 as a publisher. Uh, Original Twitter, like 2006 version of Twitter, is considered a platform.
Right.
Twitter's not publishing anything. Twitter is merely giving users an opportunity to post what they
Yep.
want. So they're regulated as a platform. And Twitter's not making, aside from some like really basic stuff on like legal liability issues, they're not taking down a ton of content, and they're not making a ton of editorial decisions about which content to promote
Right.
necessarily. Uh, I don't know how to think about ChatGPT with respect to that platform versus publisher kind of distinction. Because on the one hand, it's a venue for users to input,
Yep.
um, and ChatGPT is just model weights, right? They're
Yeah.
hosting model weights, and you give an input, it gives an output. On the other hand, like those model weights are kind of responsible for what gets published.
Right.
There's not kind of merely a platform
Yeah.
in that kind of respect. And this is setting aside the intellectual property that goes into training and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Right. Right.
Um, Spotify similarly, right? So Spotify, there's some technicalities. They own some studios, in which case they're
Yep.
they're publishers, but they're generally considered a platform. But they also make algorithmic recommendations on what shows you should listen to. They
Mm.
systematically promote some shows over others based on what they think you'd want to listen to.
Right.
That sounds awfully similar to an editorial decision that, say, a newspaper or a radio show would make. Um, and I don't think fair to call Spotify a publisher in the same way that we call
Yeah.
the radio station a publisher, but they're not just a platform, right? They're not merely hosting other people's content. They're recommending
Right.
some based on their own secret sauce. Um, of what goes in the algorithm. So I think we generally need to like rethink what we care about and what those distinctions are. Um, Setting aside what you think the actual right regulatory framework ought to be, I don't think we have the right one currently.
Right.
But that's as far as I can get from my seat as a political scientist and not an IP or regulation
Yeah.
lawyer.
Of course. I think just my concern is that kind of the regulation ongoing and kind of the upkeep with artificial intelligence is
Mhm.
not as fast as it should be. I'm kind of unsure about how the regulation currently works, but I just feel like in a society where AI is evolving so incredibly rapidly, where every other month there's a new model that can do this and that and this, new things that just were unprecedented, like even 6 months ago, I guess. There has to be some more like regulation towards that respect. Do you think this would benefit more from like, a technocratic view of people who are kind of experts in the field, or kind of, generally what we've seen with like politicians and different types of, regulators?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, it's a mix, right? So the framework we sort of the abstract idea of like the modern democratic state is you need some democratic input on what the goals are, right? What does the public actually want out of the AI industry, out of these models, and what doesn't it want? Right? What are we
Right,
worried about? You need some democratic input on the front end to set those goals. You should not expect me or you or the median American voter to actually nail down the precise legalese of how to instantiate those goals. Um, but you need some input on what the goals are. And so we're only just starting to understand. This gets back, coming full circle here on measuring public opinion. How does the public actually think about this stuff, and what is the right way to measure attitudes toward AI
right.
when public understanding on so much of these models is itself in its infancy? Everyone's just becoming acquainted with
Yeah,
what these things are, what they're capable of, what the relevant considerations even are. But we shouldn't, I don't think, start making a bunch of regulatory decisions without, some public input mediated through our electoral institutions. But then once we have some sense of what the goals are, yeah, we should let the technocrats sort out exactly how to how to implement those goals. We need some technical expertise involved in understanding how to trade off, getting the good stuff out of these models without sort of running away into all of the post-apocalyptic sci-fi we've all read. Um,
Yeah, of course. Seen one too many of those movies.
yeah.
I guess kind of then the last question is how do we kind of judge this whole AI race in kind of two respects. I think the first is geopolitically with other countries like China. How do we kind of ensure that the processes of developing AI and kind of regulating AI and deploying AI specifically is kind of in line with what we want as, a population. And I think the second is even within, like domestically within the United States, you see Anthropic and OpenAI and Gemini and all of these different companies kind of racing to the bottom, quote unquote, to build data centers, to do all of these, to kind of reach super intelligence as fast as possible. How do we kind of ensure that incentives are aligned? How is that kind of played out in history, and how can we kind of apply those things to, the modern
Uh,
day?
yeah, so there was some really scary research a year or two ago. One of the interesting applications of these models is there's an old method called agent-based modeling, which did not originally have AI connotations. And the idea is for things that are interesting scientifically, but you can't experiment on, say war, right? We can't run a bunch of experiments and say like if we randomize this thing, do we observe war or not,
Right,
right? Because then you're bunch of reasons why you don't do that. So when you have these kind of complex processes or things you can't run an experiment on, you can model them computationally using agents that take decision rules and interact with each other and things like that. So this is
right.
actually very common for decades in modeling international conflict.
Yeah,
Right? And large language models there's now a little sub-literature of using large language models in agent-based modeling kind of approaches. Um, and it turned out someone did this with war games and found that the language models, particularly the models without the HR compliant guardrails that you and I get when we interact with ChatGPT,
yeah,
are very belligerent. They're very escalatory. When you turn over sort of military decision making to them, you get more escalation than you do when humans are at the wheel.
right.
Um, which seems problematic generally, right? So we should be a little worried about like our military leaders being really gung ho about turning over decision making to models because they're quote unquote unbiased or they're faster. They don't need to hold a meeting to make a decision, that kind of thing. You might actually want humans to have a meeting before making military decisions. Like that's something we
Right.
should want slowed down, perhaps. Um, in terms of the sort of private sector side, we should be thinking about these as businesses as much as we think about them as in terms of the services they're providing. Um, and you know, and aside from regulating the product, like regulating the financial side as well. So there's widespread concerns that the industry is in this kind of recursive money shifting cycle that's creating a
Yeah,
bubble because they can play these accounting tricks that we haven't regulated against yet.
right.
We should probably think about the finances of of these businesses too,
Yeah,
so they don't take the entire economy down when the bubble pops. Yeah, so I guess the short answer to your questions is yes. We should be we should be thinking about this stuff. But so much of it is like we haven't already written the rules that govern these kinds of businesses because they're so new, right? They're doing things that are different than what we'd already written down. So we got to think about how to write down some new rules that reflect the new environment.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. I think the most important thing is just kind of information, being
Mhm.
aware of these things to begin with, because without information, I've come to realize you can't do anything. It's impossible. So yeah,
Exactly. Yep,
well, thank you so much for joining me today.
for
Have a
sure.
great rest of your day.
Thanks. You too.
Thank you.
Mhm.